The standard for early childhood in the United States right now is generally spent indoors. Children usually spend the time with nannies or in a daycare while their parents are at work, and rarely go outside in some cases. Not all, but in some cases. But for me and many other children that grew up in Hawaii, we grew up very differently. The beach was our daycare. So in my personal experience, I would go down to the beach 5-6 times a week with a parent and a group of friends. And the sand and the waves are some of my fondest memories from when I was a child. Naturally, as I grew older, I wanted to leave the safety of the beach and go further and further out into the water like most children that grow up around waves like this do. And I started out bodyboarding, eventually moving to windsurfing, until I settled on my current ocean sport, kite surfing. But as I grew older, I noticed that something was changing in this ocean that I loved so much. And at first I attributed it to just the wonder of childhood being lost on me. Maybe my fond childhood memories were kind of corrupting my experiences and making them seem fonder than they actually were. But in reality, with a little bit more research and observation, I realized that there was something a little bit darker at place. So unfortunately, our beautiful Maui beaches are in serious danger. So this somewhat alarming slide is from a few years ago, 2015. And this is the result of El Nino, which was a warm water pattern that occurs about every 4 years. And this is just a display of how quickly the coral reefs that are responsible for so much biodiversity in our oceans can fall into disarray. So briefly, I'd like to talk about what this actually is. What is coral bleaching? So the whole reason why this system works is because coral polyps, which are the small bits on the outside of the coral, have a symbiotic relationship with algae. The algae takes energy from the sun, turns it into sugar through photosynthesis, and this sugar is what's responsible for about 80% of the coral reef's food. And in return, the coral reef provides protection and a place to live for these algae. But when one of these two parts of the whole fall, the whole system can fall with it. So this is some drastic images of coral bleaching. These are in two of the most heavily hit areas in the world, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and the Florida Keys. And unfortunately, our beaches here in Hawaii are going through a very similar process. So what exactly is causing this? So there's a few different reasons why this is happening on a global basis. The probably biggest one is global warming, as the ocean temperature rising by just a few degrees can be enough to kill the algae and therefore kill the coral. And another one is runoff. So chemical runoffs and other runoffs from our land going out into the ocean can prove disastrous for the ocean life there that aren't used to these chemicals. But here in Hawaii, for the most part, because we have so many people going in and out of the water every day, probably the largest contributor to coral bleaching is this little guy and other chemicals like it. This is Oxybenzone, and it's found in sunscreen. It's a carbon-based organic compound that's microscopically small. So small, in fact, that it can penetrate through your skin layer and stay there, eventually going into your blood and other places. But what it does there is when you go out into the sun, the UV rays that would ordinarily damage your skin are instead reflected and absorbed and redistributed by this small chemical. So this is just a pretty standard high SPF sunscreen. And as you can see, oxybenzone is in it in a concentration of about 6%. And there are other chemicals like this that are similarly damaging to the reef. So something you might not know about oxybenzone is that it actually, because it's so small, nanoscopically small, it can travel through your skin and it'll implant itself into your urine and other areas. So a 2008 study discovered by the Environmental Health Perspective discovered that in their sample size, 96.8% of everyone that they studied had oxybenzone in their urine to some extent. So this means that likely every one of us here in this room right now has this oxybenzone in our bodies because of the sunscreen that we put in ourselves every day. So what does this mean? Well, oxybenzone isn't necessarily a bad thing for humans. There hasn't been any studies showing that this alien chemical is doing anything to us. But for other smaller organisms like algae and coral and some fish, it can have very different effects. So there's just one thing that you take away from this talk, is that never use these aerosol sunscreens on the beach. These aerosol sunscreens, as we all know, come in a spray form, and when the day is windy, that spray can travel up to 1,000 feet down the beach. And this isn't a good thing, because when it lands on the sand, it'll accumulate there. When the tide comes in, picks it up, and brings it back out, it gets in the ocean in a much greater extent than just putting it on your skin would. And another way that Oxybenzone can get into the ocean is, like I said before, it's in almost all of our urines. The vast, vast majority of our by waste products contain this chemical to some extent. So this means that sewage processing plants that are then released into the ocean have a much higher percentage of oxybenzone than even our beaches, which is something to think about for sure. This map was put together by the Heredicus Environmental Laboratory, who I was actually heavily inspired by because they came to Maui and for some legislation, and it inspired me greatly. But this shows some points of interest on our map. Up there in West Maui, there's a point that has 4,252 parts per trillion of this chemical oxybenzone. You might be wondering what beach that is. That is Black Rock in Honolulu, which is the most dense beach on our island for this chemical. But almost all of the beaches on our island have similar effects. And why this chemical is so dangerous to algae in particular is that the algae are used to absorbing 100% of their energy from the sun. And when they've got this sun-repelling, sun-absorbing element on them, they can't make food, so they die. So that's all quite bad. But there's another attribute to this chemical that's even worse, that I'm sure that not many of you are even aware of. So oxybenzone, this chemical, is what's known as an endocrine disruptor, meaning that it artificially creates estrogen in simple life forms like coral and some fish, like I talked about before. And what this means is that it penetrates their reproductive organs and disrupts the natural balance of hormones that are within it. And with every generation of coral that's affected by this chemical in the ocean, a higher percentage of the children of the next generation of coral will be born female, until eventually that moves up to 100%, and we get what, for lack of a better term, is called a zombie coral reef, meaning that it appears alive. You can do tests on it to determine that it is in fact alive, but they're 100% female, meaning that they can't reproduce anymore. After all of those coral polyps die, the whole reef will die, and there will be no saving it. So, and this doesn't just apply to coral. This here is probably the most well-known hermaphroditic fish, the clownfish. And these fish in the wild will have the strongest fish be a female, which is responsible for laying all the eggs. And when this female dies, the next strongest male up in the hierarchy will take its place as the female and go through a transition. And just as a brief aside, in the movie Finding Nemo, when the mom dies at the beginning of the film, the dad would instead become the mom. So it's not too scientifically accurate, the film is. I gotta praise them for all the work they did on the coral reef, but that one integral part of the film isn't actually accurate. But when these fish and other fish like it that are hermaphroditic by nature are exposed to this chemical that messes with the estrogen levels in their bodies, a lot of them will go through a mass transition, meaning that their entire colony will become female and therefore not be able to reproduce. Oh, so you might be wondering, that is a horrible thing. It's happening in our oceans. Our reefs are dying, our fish are dying. But for us, mainly, most of our lives take place in the land, and we don't go in the ocean that much. So how is this really affecting us? Well, like I already spoiled for you guys, this is the leading factor to our economy, tourism. Here in Hawaii, the majority of our economy is based on tourists. And people come to Hawaii to look at the beauty of nature. They want to go lounge on the beach. They want to go see all of the animals and beauty that we have in our islands. And a lot of them want to go out into the ocean, put on their snorkels, put on some scuba gear, go look at our reefs, and go look at all of the biodiversity we have in the water. And unfortunately, this oxybenzone chemical is making it so that the algae is starting to die, which is making the coral die. And once the algae dies, the small fish that feed on the algae won't have anything to eat. And once something low on the food chain like this crumbles, all the things above it will also crumble until we'll have very little natural biodiversity in the reef. And unfortunately, as in some other areas like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and the Florida Keys, just as examples, the tourism has greatly dropped. All the tourists that have been wanting to go out and scuba dive or snorkel are seeing that there's nothing there for them to look at except skeletons. So a great amount of them are being turned away. And if we don't make a change, this could happen to our economy as well. So if the coral reefs die, a great part of our economy could die as well, along with it. So what can we do? Well, these are three great alternatives. What I have here on the left is baby sunscreen. So something interesting about baby sunscreen, the FDA actually made it illegal to put oxybenzone and other chemicals like this in baby sunscreen. So for every sunscreen that's aimed at children 6 years and younger, you won't find any of these chemicals within it, and they're still very capable of protecting you from the sun. This here in the middle is what oxybenzone was developed as an alternative to. This is a zinc-based sunscreen, and there's other mineral-based sunscreens like it. And when you spread these sunscreens on the skin, you might remember, some people still use them, but they were most popular in the 70s and 80s. You get bright white streaks or bright streaks of other color. And people decided that that was cosmetically unattractive. So they decided to make the alternative, which ended up being oxybenzone. But, like I always say, if it ain't broke, why fix it? These sunscreens still work just as well as they did back in the day. And most importantly, they don't damage the coral in any way. It's natural minerals that is released off of your skin, and this doesn't damage the coral. And lastly, probably the most easy to facilitate, and probably the best way of keeping yourself protected from the sun without putting chemicals into our ocean, just cover yourself up. Next time you go to the beach, consider wearing a hat. How about a rash guard? It's not the most difficult thing in the world to put on. And every inch of skin that's covered by shade or covered by another material is another bit of oxybenzone that isn't going into our ocean. So cover it up and you won't have to use this sunscreen. So if all of this is so bad, why haven't we changed anything? Like if you go to our stores on Maui today, you can still find high SPF sunscreen with oxybenzone in it. So as some of you might already be aware, in October of 2017, we actually did try and do something about it. Maui County was in fact the first county in the entire United States to try and ban this oxybenzone chemical. And shortly after, a few months after, Hawaii as a state decided to band together and try and ban it as well. But as I already said, you can go to the store today and still find oxybenzone sunscreen. So what happened? Well, Washington DC based lobbyist group that's actually works in conjunction with the companies that create this oxybenzone chemical brought up two key points in opposition to our push. The first of which being that oxybenzone on a global basis isn't even the #1 cause of coral bleaching. The two biggest causes of coral bleaching by far in the world are global warming and runoff. And those are two things that are somewhat out of our control right now. We can't really fix that. So their argument is that why ban oxybenzone if it's not even the biggest thing? And that is a fact. And their second argument is that because we're a state, we're not even the entire country that's trying to push for this, that with something with implications as massive as this, we would have to pass it on a federal level. So we would have to ban it altogether in the country. And unfortunately, we don't have enough support and enough funding to make a huge decision like that right now. But in Hawaii, which all of us here live in, and I'm sure everyone here loves, the biggest factor to our coral reefs dying is because of the tourists visiting our beaches every day, but because of us even visiting the beaches as often as we can. A vast amount of these chemicals are being introduced into the ocean. So let's save our reefs. All we have to do is limit the amount of oxybenzone that we're introducing into the water. Wear a hat next time you go to the beach. Never use the aerosol-based sunscreen. That's not very intelligent. And if we do all of these things, if we eventually get abandoned even, we can make our reefs that once looked like this, completely dead and barren, look like this again. So let's save our reefs and get this done with. Thank you.